Jayson J. Smart, political analyst at the Kiev Post. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Great to see you.
So how much of a problem is it in the Baltic states right now? Obviously, they have many policies in place against such interference, but regrettably, Russia is not giving up, right?
No, Russia is certainly not giving up. It's trying the best it can to divide people. And it's really less about trying to convince them that Russia is, let's say, the good guy, but more about how we can push people away from supporting the cause of Ukraine, supporting NATO, and supporting actually their own self-interest. And Russia is trying, but it looks like the Baltic states as a whole have remained very firm.
So overall, as you said, Russia is actually involved in these sort of activities. But this begs the question, how can organizations which are not part of the government actually remain resilient? We know the government has many agencies to screen certain suspect individuals, but what about, for example, NGOs? A nice guy comes along, he says, I have an initiative, and they really don't have a way to actually verify whether he is not acting in someone else's interest. How do you go about this sort of issue?
Well, this is perpetually a problem. When somebody shows up on the scene, if it's a politician or otherwise, they could be as they call it, astroturfing. You're creating a fake cause to rally people. You're saying that you're representing the farmers or something like this, but in fact, it's serving Russia's interest. And so these useful idiots that exist in society, which there are very many, have different ways that they manipulate the population. I think that there's a couple of questions that one can ask himself. One is simply, where does the money come from? Usually that's a question that's unknown, and that usually should raise red flags. But also, ultimately, in whose interest does this serve? Does this somehow serve the national interest in a way that's clear? Or is this somehow actually ultimately going to divide people and push them away from what is in the long-term national security interest of the state? And I think that most times it will come down very clearly that no, it's not serving the national security interest, and no, it's not very clear where the money comes from. That should usually push people away or show them very clearly that the leaders of these ideologies are people who are actually operating perhaps as bad actors.
So these bad actors have many agendas and they have many narratives that they are using. What are the most prevalent ones? For example, in the Baltics, in Central and Eastern Europe, how are they trying to disguise themselves as something they are not?
There's been a lot of different narratives that have been used. I mean, among the most common ones, of course, have been those that it's arguing, interestingly, that it's to those countries' security interests to not be involved in the war. This war is something that's going to drag out. This war is something that's going to involve them eventually. And so it's better to be out of it. Another one that's very common is that ultimately it's working against their state security due to the number of migrants. The use of migrants is something that Russia and Belarus has militarized. As we saw, as you recall very well, before the war in Ukraine began, migrants was something that's already being militarized by the Belarusians to try to create public division. And this is something that's still happening today. It would seem very clear to us that Russia is always trying to find these sort of clinging issues, these sort of side issues to distract people, whether they argue there's a Ukrainianization of what's going on in the Baltic states, which is something they do argue there, which the general public does not support, does not believe in, but it's something that's obviously being pushed. And the reason is very simple. They realize that will resonate with some people and distracts from the central issue, which is Russia's aggression, and distracts them and talks about migrants. Listen, migrants is not the biggest issue. Everyone understands that. But there's a certain segment of the population that will buy into that and will be distracted from what this is really about.
Should state agencies take a more proactive role in the fight against disinformation on social media? Recently, it has become more difficult on one particular medium because of its rather unusual policies regarding disinformation. Do you believe that it is time for state organizations to step in?
I think there's a very clear decision. Those organizations, or I should say those corporations that deal with social media, sort of have two options. They can either come with some way of improving this and making sure that there is not fake news, there's not Russian propaganda, or they can face another option, which is called regulation. Corporations do not like regulation. So if they're unwilling to take the steps necessary to defend the general public against Russian-based propaganda and to make sure that the truth gets out, then I think it's quite reasonable that a government defends its own national security interests and begins to regulate that industry, which will be expensive for those companies and will definitely cost them in the long term. So it's much better to get ahead of the curve and to take the steps necessary to prevent that from happening.
Now, do you believe that looking beyond the Baltics, there are any risks associated with, for example, the Polish political scene? Can you see any examples of any entities trying to worm their way into public consciousness, perhaps trying to spread these narratives we were referring to?
Absolutely, there are. There is definitely a push, as you know, by minority parties specifically, that's pushing the Stop Ukrainianization movement within the country. They are also pushing for things against the U.S. embassy, or saying that this is part of the U.S. hegemony that Poland's being forced to accept in order to push some sort of division within the NATO partnership, not just simply push people away from Ukraine, but push against the NATO partnership as a whole. This should definitely raise red flags. Once again, Russia understands it is not popular as a whole across Poland or across the Baltic states, but it does understand there are specific issues it can sort of piggyback on and try to get the public to become divided against what would be Russia's interest.
Now, there has been a discussion regarding a certain candidate, Mr. Kołodziejczak in Poland, a farming activist, basically. Would you say that this also falls within the umbrella of that sort of influence?
He specifically, I would argue, is probably one of those people that can answer the question of where his money comes from or why it is that he's jumped on this and is pushing it the way he is. Let's be realistic, is the entire myth, essentially, that he's trying to build is something that is operating against Polish national security interest. It is something that's obviously against NATO, and it's something that ultimately he is doing for reasons that we cannot be clear. Why is he doing this? This is for farming. But let's be honest. If he believes that what he's pushing is somehow beneficial to Poland, I would ask him, okay, what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, is it not clear that Poland would be the next logical target? And if he thinks that what is happening in Ukraine is somehow permissible or acceptable, was the Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939 permissible and acceptable? Was that a liberation? And if he does not believe it is, then he should obviously renounce what has happened to Ukraine and be supportive of them, because otherwise we can expect Poland to face similar national security threats to those that today Ukraine is facing.
And regrettably, Russia has also been exploiting the issue of farming, generally the food insecurity of many countries, not just in the region, especially by terminating the grain deal and right now by attacking grain facilities in Ukraine. So this should be at the forefront of any initiatives. Luckily, there seems to be an overall agreement in the region that Russia must be stopped, with the unfortunate exception of the Hungarian government. Jeyson Jay Smart was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.